The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
It's the news everyone is waiting for. When will vaccines become available for all Canadians? Tonight, we're assessing what's likely, how it will happen, and why can't these critically important medicines be made in Canada? Then, our Ontario hubs explain changes on the horizon for provincial conservation authorities, and from the evolution of local manufacturing to the well-being of seniors during this crisis, we've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, December 4th, and that's all ahead on the agenda. As the first vaccines for COVID-19 get closer to market, this week Canada found itself asking some tough questions. When will they land on our shores? Who will get them first? And why aren't we making them here in the first place? The answers aren't simple, and to help us through them, we're joined from Ontario's capital city by the waterfront, Stephen Hoffman, Director of the Global Strategy Lab and Professor of Global Health, Law and Political Science at York University. And in Riverdale, close to me, Kelly Grant, National Health Reporter for the Global Mail. Hi, so nice to see you both.
Thanks for having us.
So before we get into the discussion, I want to roll a clip of the Prime Minister. Sheldon, could you please roll?
I know people are really eager to find out, when are we going to get to that starting line? When are we going to start giving people vaccines? And we're working as hard as we can to make that as quickly as possible. But at the same time, what really matters is when we get to cross the finish line. And the fact that the doctors highlighted that if all goes according to plan, we should be able to have the majority of Canadians vaccinated by next September puts us in very good stead.
Stephen, you know, and both Kelly, it's been a really difficult time for everyone. And I think when people heard September, it wasn't what they wanted to hear. Why a September timeline, Stephen?
Well, I think we all want to be vaccinated for COVID-19 as fast as possible because we all want to get through this extraordinary time in our lives. The reality, though, is it takes time first to develop a vaccine. And now that we have a vaccine that's about to be approved, it takes time to manufacture enough doses for the world to be able to all have it and benefit from its effectiveness. And so, yes, we have heard that it might be as early as this month that vaccines are starting to be used in the human population, which is great. But it takes time to manufacture enough doses and roll it out across our country.
And also, I guess, to see if the vaccine is safe as well, right?
That's right. I think one thing that's really important when it comes to vaccines or any medical product is that we don't want to rush the approval. We don't want to be cutting corners. And the good news is in Canada, we have one of the very best health products regulators, that's Health Canada, and they're not cutting corners. And the reason why that's so important is because when every Canadian gets a vaccine, they need to have the confidence that it's effective and it's safe. And that's what's going to happen once we get that seal of approval from Health Canada.
September is, in the past, we've been hearing how long it takes to get a vaccine. And this vaccine came faster than a lot of people. In the past, it's taken somewhere between 4 to 5 years. Kelly, how did we get here so quickly?
Well, I think a big part of it was just that there was a ton of money on the table, a huge global effort. And so as a result, things moved in a way that they just haven't in the past. I think as well, when it came to actually testing the vaccine during these very large phase 3 clinical trials, there's just so much of this vaccine, or excuse me, this virus circulating right now that getting to the initial endpoints of this trial happened much faster than you would expect because just a lot of people got sick in the placebo groups very quickly, and they were able to come to conclusions about how well, particularly these first 2 mRNA vaccines, seem to work.
And Stephen, we're going to talk a little later on in the show about why Canada is not in a position to produce these vaccines domestically. Is it right when people, you know, you hear the criticism towards the Prime Minister saying that the government didn't act fast enough. Is it fair? Is that criticism fair?
Well, so as a lawyer and an epidemiologist, I think what's really important to note is that we are as prepared for a pandemic as we allow ourselves to be before the pandemic starts. In a sense, what that means is to prepare effectively for anything like this, it's years that's in the making of investments in our public health infrastructure, but also choices that have been made to not invest in that public health infrastructure. I mean, it was just weeks before this pandemic started that several provinces actually cut public health budgets. And so then when Canadians might be frustrated with the lack of a response to a pandemic, partially it's based on the lack of investments that was made in public health leading up to the pandemic. When it comes to vaccine production, though, we live in a globally connected world, and over the last few decades, there's been a globalization of the medical supply chain. And part of that is because Canadians and taxpayers all ask their government to be procuring products as cheaply as possible, which has left a lack of capacity within Canada to be making some things. Now, we can in Canada produce some vaccines, but we don't have the capacity to produce the newest mRNA vaccines, for which the two leading COVID-19 vaccines are.
How is that different from the vaccines from the past?
Well, there's various different ways of making vaccines. One is, for example, making a vaccine out of a weakened version of the virus. Another is to insert a genetic sequence into another kind of virus, like an adenovirus, which is what the AstraZeneca Oxford virus has done. That would allow, it would prompt a response from the human immunology that would protect people from this virus. More recently, they've used an mRNA platform, which instead of giving a virus, it's actually just giving the genetic code that would directly prompt that human immunological response, providing that protective effect. So there are different ways of producing viruses. They then require different kind of production capacity. And that, I think, is what's clear here. In the rollout for this vaccine, it's manufacturing that's going to be the rate limiting step.
And Kelly, you've been covering this story since it began. And a lot of the way that we've been able to control this is personal behavior, wearing the masks, staying home, physical distance, working from home. 9 months, what the Prime Minister said, to have the whole country vaccinated. That's a long time. September is a very long time away. We're talking about COVID fatigue. How do we get to the finish line?
Well, I think one of the first things is that I feel like we shouldn't be talking so much about the finish line. I think the starting line really is important. I mean, this virus is very hard on the old, it's very hard on the medically vulnerable, and it's been very hard on the healthcare system because there are so many people at the front lines who've either gotten sick or who are having to go into isolation because they have been exposed to the virus. So we're looking at, in Canada, having 6 million doses of these first two vaccines in the country in the first quarter of 2021. That's enough to vaccinate 3 million people because these first ones are all 2-dose vaccines. So I think that if we are able to vaccinate people in long-term care, workers in long-term care, frontline healthcare workers, and a decent chunk of the population over the age of 80, the difference that will make in terms of severe illness, the difference that will make in terms of death is really profound. And this is not to say that it doesn't matter that, people like me and you who are younger and healthier shouldn't take the vaccine. We all need it. I can't wait for September to come. I am excited. I will be first in line when my term comes. But in the meantime, let's not underplay how important this sort of first wave of vaccines could be to bringing down the death count in Canada.
Do you worry, though, that, we do hear, I think it's just human behavior, or when you do hear that there is a vaccine available, it's kind of like, oh, phew, we're almost out of this, hell that we've all been living. Do you worry that that's going to start to affect personal behavior, people being a bit more relaxed in how they should be protecting themselves?
I do worry about it. I really feel like the message has to be, hang on. Stick with these basic public health measures. Wear your mask. Don't spend time with people indoors who you don't live with. These measures are really important right now, and they will be for several more months. But I also feel like there's a big difference in feeling as though you are being asked to do this indefinitely until the end of time and being told that if you hang on for a few more months, you can save a lot of lives, and there is a light at the end of this tunnel, and we will get our lives back. So let's hang on until then. And I think public health officials have to work really hard to get that message across.
Stephen, I see you nodding.
I agree 100% with Kelly. I think that we do need to be focused on effective public health messaging at this time. We have seen during this pandemic, not always has that public health messaging been as clear as what we need. And I think the messaging is exactly as Kelly just said. We need people to hang on, hang in there, keep on doing these measures. They're saving lives, they're protecting families, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel and reason for all of us to be optimistic as we go through what will likely be a very difficult winter.
Stephen, last night the news broke that Pfizer will have to have its production from 100 million doses due to a shortage of raw materials. What does that do to timelines?
Well, the shortages that they're affecting their production were things that were affecting over the last few weeks. So in that respect, it's new news for the public. It's not new news for those who are deeply involved in vaccine production and procurement. So it is unlikely to affect the timelines that have been discussed within the last couple of weeks. That being said, it does highlight the inherent risks involved in the medical supply chain in terms of seeing potential future delays. I think that's why we're seeing such hesitation from our political leaders and public health leaders to give any definitive dates, because a vaccine is complicated. Deploying it is complicated. There's many steps along the way that could result in delays. And as a result, in a time when Canadians want certainty, but more so, I think Canadians want truth, and they want clear knowledge from their leaders about what their leaders know. And so that's this example of delay in a manufacturing process that, for no one's fault, highlights why we need to be open to when this is happening, but also feel confident that we're going to be soon have those access to vaccines, and that's a good thing.
Well, you mentioned truth, and this didn't seem like breaking news to either one of you. Is this something that the public should have known sooner, Kelly?
I found that story quite bizarre, to be honest with you. Pfizer had been talking about trying to get to a goal of 100 million doses by the end of 2021. The last time I believe they spoke about that number publicly was late summer. They put the 50 million number, this new revised lower number, in a press release on November 9th. Now, mind you, of course, that was the same day they announced their interim results from their trial. And so that number, I think, got perhaps lost to the public. But there were several news stories that talked about this pending production cut. And I think the important thing for everybody here in Canada is that the numbers the government has been speaking about publicly for the last few weeks have already taken that lower than expected production capacity into account. So I think everyone freaked out a little bit about that piece of news, but I don't think it should have a material impact on the number of doses we're able to receive here in Canada. We've been working with those numbers for a few weeks now.
Well, Stephen, we've been hearing that the Canadian government has several contracts with different manufacturing companies for the vaccines. How do these contracts work?
Well, those contracts were mostly signed in the summer before the vaccines were finished their trials, before we knew whether they're effective. Essentially, the government was trying to cover all of its bases. I mean, we don't know which, or we didn't know until more recently, which vaccine was going to come to market first. And so it made sense for government to be pre-purchasing as many vaccines from a different manufacturers and companies as possible to ensure that Canadians were at the front of the line along with other rich countries. And so that's what's done. I mean, the reality is that the health, social, and economic consequences of this pandemic are so big that there's no amount of candidates for vaccines that we could purchase that would be overdone. The hope, though, is that we have purchased over 350 million doses, well more than what the Canadian population will need. The hope is that any extra that's been purchased would be put to good use by donating it to low-income countries, which frankly, up until now, have been totally left out of this vaccine race, which is really unfair.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. Kelly, why have we ordered so many vaccines when we have a country that's a tenth of the population of that?
Well, as I understand it, the Canadian government's thinking was that they just had to place a wide array of bets because they didn't know which one would come through. So it's fortunate that two of the bets we placed on Pfizer and Moderna, that those companies have come out with pretty solid results. We've also placed bets on the J&J vaccine, the Novavax vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, which has had a bit of a hiccup, but is further along than some of the other ones I mentioned. So I think the thinking was never that we would need 350 million doses. It was just making a bet that not all of these vaccines would prove to be safe and effective. And, none of them still at this point have Health Canada approval. So we'll see how the rest of things go with the remaining vaccines. But it was just basically placing a large number of bets.
I know you've both seen the news of people saying that, because we're now seeing that the UK has approved Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine. And there's a sentiment that Canada is going to be at the end of the line. Stephen, assuming that we're all looking at the same data, why has the UK approved the vaccine before the US or Canada?
Well, just to clarify, Canada's definitely not at the end of the line. I mean, we placed those bets, as Kelly referred to them as, and those orders in the summer, which means that Canada will be close to the front of the line, along with several other rich countries that were able to pre-purchase those vaccines. In terms of the regulatory approval process, we in Canada have one of the most thorough, comprehensive, and careful health product regulators in the world. Health Canada is famous for ensuring that any product they approve will be safe for Canadians. And so different regulators will be going through and have slightly different processes. But the key is that we are already seeing that the Health Canada review is moving along at a similar pace to international counterparts. And everyone expects that that review will be finished this month. And in any event, whether Health Canada approved it today, next week, or even at the end of this month, that's not what's going to be the rate limiting step. Ultimately, what will be slowing down the full-scale use of vaccines in Canada is going to be just getting our hands on enough supply. And the challenge with that is that 7 billion people want it at the same time.
Well, the UK, they will start immunizing their citizens in a couple of weeks. We're nowhere near those timelines. Kelly, do you think people are getting anxious? Do you think that the UK was too quick to approve it, or were we too slow?
I don't necessarily think either, actually. I mean, I haven't been able to personally look at their submissions, so I'm sort of reluctant to judge. I'm reluctant to judge the UK's decision to move as quickly as they did. That being said, I think, I feel like for the last sort of week or two, basically ever since the Prime Minister got up and said, we are not going to be at the front of the line because of this issue of domestic production, that we've sort of all been in a tizzy focusing on this question of when and how we're going to get vaccines. The thing I'm actually much more interested and concerned about is, are we ready to receive these vaccines? Several of the provinces haven't rolled out any kind of vaccine plan. I was speaking, a fair bit this week with long-term care home operators and people who represent workers in these places, and they haven't been given any information about when and how they are to roll out these vaccines. Stephen keeps talking, and rightly so, about the issue of supply and manufacturing, but another big issue is, are we in Canada going to be ready to roll these vaccines out on the ground as quick as possible? Because particularly in settings like long-term care, time is lives. Dozens of people are dying in these settings every day, and the sooner we can get a safe and effective vaccine to them, the better.
Stephen, is this something that concerns you as well, the rollout?
It does, I think, in particular for the Pfizer vaccine, which does require super cold freezing. So that vaccine has to be kept at negative 80 degrees Celsius in order for it to remain effective. Now, maintaining that kind of super cold chain is not easy. That is a lot colder than most vaccines need to be kept. And so there just aren't so many freezers in Canada that can keep a vaccine at negative 80 degrees Celsius. We're really talking about dry ice. And so as a result, those kind of plans that Kelly was talking about that really will be rolled out at the provincial level, because it's the provinces that have responsibility for healthcare in our country, that will need to be robust to make sure that vaccine not only can get to Canadians, but can stay at negative 80 degrees Celsius the entire time.
And Kelly, you talked a little bit about it, but what would the rollout look like?
So the Pfizer vaccine, which I'll talk about first, because it does appear to be the one that's likeliest to get approval first. What they're planning to do is the vaccine's being made in both Belgium and in Michigan, and then they're doing a sort of just-in-time delivery. So there are going to be 14 different distribution points across the country. We just learned about this at a briefing yesterday, where Pfizer can deliver the vaccine in a just-in-time fashion to these, sort of very large ultra-cold freezers. And then it will be up to the provinces in cooperation with the military to actually get these vaccines out and into people's arms. And as I said, I think the first phase, there's general agreement that it does look like it is going to begin in long-term care and possibly in hospitals as well. So, these vaccines, the ultra-cold ones that Pfizer makes, can be kept in a sort of like travel pack with dry ice, and can be kept a few days in that fashion outside of these ultra-cold freezers. So when it comes to long-term care, I think the thinking is that, essentially they'll drive up with these boxes of dry ice vaccines and just, inoculate as many people as they possibly can.
And Stephen, this is something that we've been hearing about, who is going to get it first. How can the distribution of a COVID-19 vaccine be done in a safe and equitable way? Who should get it first?
Well, within a country, I think it's clear that those who are most vulnerable to severe COVID-19, as well as those who we depend upon to mount the healthcare response, need to be first. So as Kelly mentioned, that means the residents of long-term care facilities, mostly seniors, but also healthcare providers who are working in hospitals and clinics across the country. I think, though, it raises a question about when you think beyond the individual country, that we are seeing right now a very unfair system where certain countries will get this vaccine, Canada included. Other countries aren't even starting to be able to think about vaccine deployment because they haven't even been able to purchase any, whether available or not. And so in that respect, when we think of equitable and fairness, yes, we have to think who gets it first within Canada, but we also should be thinking about who should be getting it first around the world, because there's lots of vulnerable people and healthcare providers in poorer countries who are not going to get it in 2020 and not in 2021 either.
When we do also talk about Canada, we have a lot of remote communities, and Kelly, with how Canada has treated Indigenous communities right now, we can't even get clean drinking water to those communities. So how can we get a vaccine to in an equitable way in this situation?
So yeah, I would say that's a very large concern. There's been lots of talk and thinking about how to ensure that particularly remote communities, remote First Nation communities, do have access to this vaccine. I should say the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, which is sort of setting out the initial priorities for who should get the vaccine first, has included those remote Indigenous communities on its list of people who should get it. So my hope certainly is that everybody who's thinking about the logistics of delivering this vaccine is thinking long and hard about how to make sure these communities can be vaccinated effectively and quickly.
We still see a percentage of people who don't believe the virus is real, and there's a percentage of people who are vaccine hesitant. What percentage of Canadians need to get the vaccine in order for us to reach herd immunity, Kelly?
So there's quite a bit of debate and discussion about that. There has been talk of something around the 70% mark. I mean, I think the truth is we don't really know, because we don't actually know whether these vaccines stop transmission. Just the way these trials were done, we know that they were very efficacious in terms of stopping disease, and that is very important. But we don't know as much about the question of transmission. So I think, that 70% estimate that's been floating around is a number to consider, but it's not a guarantee. I mean, I tend to think that by far the most important thing here is the difference that is going to be made when those people who are likeliest to fall severely ill and die from COVID have the protection these vaccines offer.
Canada has been at the forefront in the past and has contributed to historical vaccines. And a lot of a question that people have been asking is, why are we not producing this vaccine? Stephen?
Well, so currently we don't have the manufacturing capacity to produce the two leading candidates for the vaccine. So that's the it's the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. And so it's not really an option at this point. So vaccine production is something that requires a lot of advanced preparation to do. It's only efficient if it's done in very, very large quantities. So as a result, the global pharmaceutical industry has centralized its vaccine production facilities. And mostly, in terms of the latest platforms, such as the mRNA vaccine platforms, that has just not happened in Canada. Now, there's lots of reasons that point to that. I mean, so Canada isn't the largest country in the world by population. So some of the pharmaceutical companies would be choosing locations based on population, but also it depends on things like tax incentives, government support for these types of things. But this isn't something that could have happened sort of in the last couple of years. In order to create a new vaccine manufacturing plant, we're probably talking about at least a decade type of foresight and investments, and that hasn't happened.
I know it doesn't help anything to look to place blame, but moving forward, Kelly, is this a sector that we should be contributing more to?
Well, it's an interesting debate. I think everybody would like it if we had more of the ability to produce our own vaccines. And, the government has said that it intends to expand its vaccine manufacturing capacity in a National Research Council facility that's in Montreal. It made earlier promises to have that facility up and running to produce more traditional types of vaccines, and it hasn't met that deadline. It has not met that promise. But the larger question of, how do we attract investment in things like vaccine production capacity? I mean, those are big, long-term kinds of questions, and they're ones we should think about in the future, but frankly, they're not going to have a huge impact on whether we get vaccines first or early. We are going to ship these vaccines in from other places, as is almost every other country in the world. I mean, everyone is talking about the fact that the UK has approved the Pfizer vaccine and is going to be getting doses, soon. I mean, I think it should be pointed out that, Pfizer is not a UK company, and Pfizer is not producing its vaccine there, and they are going to wind up getting the vaccine either first or close to first.
Well, the opposition leader, Erin O'Toole, has criticized the government of only pre-ordering vaccines from companies like Pfizer and Moderna because our collaboration with Chinese vaccine maker CanSino collapsed. Stephen, is he right when he says that the government shouldn't have, and I quote, have put all our eggs in the basket of China?
Well, I mean, we know that Canada has put its eggs in every basket, in a sense. I mean, Canada has put a bet on every vaccine except for the Russian vaccine, which is being developed in a different way with less transparency around the trials. So in that respect, we know that based on the orders that have been put in place. I think, though, when you look at the CanSino agreements, at the time it made a lot of good sense. I mean, CanSino is a company that was founded by a Canadian-Chinese citizen. It's built on the idea of leveraging scientific collaboration between Canadian researchers and Chinese researchers, very important area. And so in that respect, I think it was one of many bets that the government placed. It didn't end up working out because the Chinese government stepped in and actually stopped the transport of vaccine candidate to Canada, where it was supposed to go through a clinical trial. But, when you're in a pandemic and the costs and the health effects are so high, it makes sense to put a bet on everything. And that's what the federal government has done.
We've run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much for both of your insights. We've all learned a lot. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Conservation authorities in Ontario learned in this fall's budget that the rules and how they operate will change. Justin Chandler covers the Hamilton-Niagara region for Ontario Hubs, and he joins us from Hamilton with more on that. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, before we talk about those changes, let's get a better understanding of how conservation authorities work in this province. Sheldon, please roll.
What is a conservation authority? Conservation authorities are agencies that deliver services and programs to protect watersheds, balancing environmental and economic needs. Watersheds are areas that drain into bodies of water. Ontario is the only province or territory in Canada with conservation authorities. Governed by the Conservation Authorities Act, they are mandated to protect people and property from flooding, as well as to conserve natural resources. Ontario first created the authorities in 1946 to protect land at risk of flooding, drought, erosion, and deforestation. After Hurricane Hazel in 1954, the province also tasked conservation authorities with forecasting flood risk and ensuring safe development near waterways. Conservation authorities are either charities or nonprofit organizations. There are 36 conservation authorities in Ontario.
Now, Justin, the Ontario government just made changes to how conservation is governed in this province. What are they?
Well, there's quite a few. One of them is a change to powers that conservation authorities currently hold. They will no longer be able to expropriate land or to issue stop work orders in significant circumstances. They will also lose citizen appointees on their boards. Currently, boards are made up of councillors and municipally appointed citizens, and they will no longer be on the board. And then another change will be in the way that appeals are done. Currently, appeals are handled at the Conservation Authority board level. However, now they are going to be new avenues where developers could appeal to local planning authority tribunals or all the way up to the minister in certain situations.
I want to touch on one of the first points that you made about exactly how much authority conservation authorities have. Do you have an example of, when one of those authorities would come and play in say, a construction zone or something like that?
Yes, there was a case in the summer in Ancaster, actually, where the HCA board chair, the Hamilton Conservation Authority board chair, he said that there was a situation where somebody was bulldozing in their backyard in a protected area. And so this was happening over the weekend, but staff found out and they were able to issue a stop work permit and get that stopped. So they were able to do something that if these new changes go ahead, they would not be able to do in order to protect land in such an example.
I'm curious, what's the response been from conservation authorities on these changes?
Well, Conservation Ontario, the organization that represents the 36 authorities, has been very critical. And I think all the local conservation authorities that I've seen so far have been doing the same thing. They've been saying that these changes need to be rethought, that they're going to damage their ability to protect watersheds, and that they're really going to favor developers and not conservation authorities. So for the most part, I would say they're quite upset.
Now, one thing that's quite interesting is sort of the funding model when we talk about conservation authorities. How does it look like, for example, in Hamilton, and are there changes to that as well?
Well, the funding model is actually going to stay the same. In Hamilton right now, I think the Hamilton Conservation Authority self-generates about 58% of its own funding. The province only puts forward 2%. And so what the board is saying is, well, you're not a major funder at all, so why do you get to dictate how we operate? But that's because they were created as part of a provincial act. So they do have that power despite only funding it at a very minimal level.
And what's interesting in this, I believe Puss Lynch also only has 1% in terms of funding that they provide to the Conservation Authority, but they may have some power in this.
Yes, this one's a bit of a head scratcher. Municipalities often share conservation authorities. The Hamilton Conservation Authority is somewhat unique because they have 11,000 acres of land, but they only share with Puss Lynch, I guess just sort of bordering one small area. And the way that the new rules go, the board chair and vice chairs will have to be shared between different municipalities. But in this case, Puss Lynch only puts forth 1% of the Hamilton Conservation Authority's budget, but the proposed changes would seem to give them eternal chair or vice chair power, which is something that is sort of a head scratcher for the board, and it's not something that the ministry addressed when I asked them about it.
Now, one thing that's been clear during the pandemic is conservation areas have been in high demand. I know you as well. It's right in your backyard where you get to kind of see them and kind of enjoy the wilderness. Tell me why other people have been enjoying them as well.
Oh, well, it's just such a great way to get out, enjoy some fresh air. I mean, our viewers might think I'm a hip man about town, but during the pandemic, the place you find me is on the trails. That's where you head out in the morning. It's not too busy. It's easy to physically distance, get some fresh air, and really just de-stress. I mean, you can see this is the Dundas Conservation Area, and it's absolutely beautiful.
Now, you had mentioned some people who are opposing these changes, but I imagine that these changes were brought in by the government because they were told some changes need to be made. Is there anyone that finds these changes a good idea?
Well, certainly the government, and so far some developers as well have been speaking out and saying that they think that these changes will create more accountability and will make it easier to deal with conservation authorities. And the conservation authorities counter and say that this should be dealt with at the local level, and if there's, say, a developer in London or a developer in Hamilton who has a problem, then they can work that out locally, but it shouldn't be done provincially.
Justin Chandler, I want to thank you so much. He is our Hamilton Niagara Hub journalist, and I might see you out on those trails one day.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
The agenda this week took stock of the federal government's fiscal update, surveyed Ontario's manufacturing sector, and got the latest on research into treatments for HIV. The agenda's Week in Review begins with the well-being of seniors during this COVID-19 crisis.
What I've really been seeing and I've been thinking about is what I might describe as kind of the psychological and also the psychiatric. I think the psychological impact is interesting because there's so many people who are kind of 70 something and above who didn't really think of themselves as frail and vulnerable. And, I think we all realized so much of the messaging initially around from public health officials, which was so important around guidance and safety. It really highlighted to so many people that they were in this kind of group that needed to be so fearful, so afraid. And so what I've seen is this sort of psychological experience of older adults who might have seen themselves, as Christina described, as really vital, really, kind of active, who then needed to think of themselves as the most vulnerable and really kind of impacted their self-concept in a way that has been, really sad as we as Dr. Stahl and I both work together. We spend so much of our work trying to empower older adults and help them to feel, vibrant and as active as they can. And it's nobody's fault. It's just the effect of some of the direction, especially in the early days. And so I've seen this sort of psychological, almost like involution, this kind of withdrawal that's happened for older adults around their, self-esteem, their sense of mortality, their sense of trying to balance like their physical health and their mental health. And I think so much of the messaging really privileged, understandably, their physical health in a way that made people feel really small and really fearful. And then I think on the psychiatric side, what I've seen, is that it's really, really hard for people who are getting more mentally unwell to access care. As many of us have talked about, one of the great things about psychiatry is you can do it virtually, like the way we're doing this conversation, but you can only do virtual care with people who can do virtual care with you. And so many older adults are marginalized, they can't access, kind of technology. And that's not meant to say that there aren't older adults who are very savvy. There are, but there are lots of people who were marginalized before this who can't access social supports, let alone psychiatric support. So it's like a double hit in terms of their well-being.
Christina, we pointed out earlier that you wrote about this for Maclean's a couple of weeks ago, and I want to read an excerpt from that article just to set up our next point of discussion. From the beginning, you wrote, there's been one constant with COVID. There's never a painless option. Living with the virus always involves some kind of taboo trade-off, staying home or going into work, hugging grandchildren or keeping a virus at bay, allowing spouses to visit or shutting the doors of long-term care to anyone who might bring in an illness. But somewhere in those trade-offs, individuals have the right to make choices about their lives. Well, this really gets to the nub of a very complicated issue, which obviously decision makers are dealing with and families are dealing with, and that is, partly is the cure for COVID worse than the disease itself, and have decision makers taken the ability of families to make their own decisions out of their hands in the interest of broader public interest? Why don't we get into some of that? Christina, what can you tell us on those two scores?
I think we're failing our older adults when we talk about this in really black and white terms, that the only options are isolation or not. And that's simply not the case. We have a lot of things we can do as families and as communities to help out older Canadians and to support them. And so one of the things that Dr. Samir Sinha had said to me is that this is a conversation we don't get to make for our grandparents or our parents. This is a decision we make with them. And we sit and talk to them about what is important. Think of it, what I found really helpful was to say, think of this as a kind of advanced care planning. Like we often think of advanced care planning as something you do for the very end of life, about what I would do for someone I love if they could no longer speak for themselves. But we're talking about a quality of life issue here. And so sit down and talk to people about what really matters to them. Is it most important to my parents that they have visits from their kids and their grandparents? And if so, how can we as a family have that conversation about how to do that as safely as possible for them? And maybe it means that I don't go out and spend my nights in restaurants or in pubs or whatever else, but my most important priority in my life is making sure that I get to see my parents and do that in a way that's safe for them.
Money's just dirt cheap right now for the government of Canada to borrow. And if you need to stimulate the economy and if you need to protect people from the worst ravages economically since the Great Depression, you can't do it much better than when you're borrowing money at 1%. In which case, isn't this the time to go deeply into debt if you have to go deeply into debt?
Well, there's if you have to go deeply into debt right now. I totally agree that the economy is going to need some help. I think that the fact that so much of that money, remember the 7 going out the door for the every dollar, a lot of that money is being banked, and there's a reason a lot of people who have banked it can't spend it. They can't travel, they can't do the things they want to do. So it's very possible, as Kevin said, that we may not need some of that stimulus, and that's why I love the idea of guardrails. I just like to know what they are. And I'm hoping that we will get that in the spring. And my fear is the reason that they haven't told us what they are is that they're going to set them up in such a way that it will justify whatever stimulus they want to spend. And the reason I think that is they've already announced they intend to stimulate without even knowing, on what basis or when they want to do it. And I find that very curious. Usually you shape a policy around saying, we want to do this, and then we find the money to do it. You don't say, we're going to spend X, and then we're going to find things to spend it on. So to your question about the price of debt, look, obviously it's better interest rates are low. It's the only reason we're not in a crisis already. But I think just assuming that they're going to stay low forever, and remember, a lot of the debt we're taking on is not long-term. A lot of it is 5-year bonds, not 30-year. They're changing that now. But it's a bit like saying I went to the casino and I had a really lucky night, so I'm just going to assume that every night is going to go the same way it did last night.
Gotcha. Well, let's talk about one of the real big-ticket items that came out of yesterday. And the commitment to spend billions and billions isn't quite there yet. It's still in the let's see what we can do phase. Here's Chrystia Freeland on child care. Sheldon, roll it if you would.
I say this both as a working mother and as a finance minister. Canada will not be truly competitive until all Canadian women have access to the affordable childcare we need to support our participation in our country's workforce.
Kevin Page, everybody's saying this. Everybody is saying that if there's anything good going to come out of this COVID-19 pandemic, it's that finally governments are going to get serious about putting a national child care program in place. However, the fine print always says childcare is a provincial responsibility. We've tried going down this road so many times in the past and haven't quite got there. What makes anybody think this time is going to be different? Let's start off with you, Kevin, on this one.
Again, you're asking really tough questions, Steve. So this is, I would say on this, that I think there's a sense, in the context of COVID-19 that there's a possibility of doing, people use the word social resets or strategic resets. And then we start to realize that, what has happened to us and, the impacts that Angela's talked about in big parts of the labor force. So, going forward, is there an opportunity to change? And with respect to the federal provincial aspects to the childcare discussion, I think the government is going to be very careful. Really, all they talked about in terms of funding this is to study it. Really tens of millions of dollars to study how could possibly we bring this about. But if we're really talking about a big program, and it's going to need tens of billions of dollars across the country in order to create a Quebec-style program. then we're just going to have to be honest that we're going to have to raise taxes. And again, I think that's the conversation for childcare, but I think there's going to be other programs, basic income programs, potentially even some climate change type of infrastructure programs. Taxes probably will going to have to go up over the medium term as we get through the crisis.
Angela, I know Rome wasn't built in a day, but I suspect there are some people who were hoping that they'd see more than just the promise to create a secretariat to look into how to doing this. Were you disappointed with this part of the announcement?
Absolutely. All of the narratives leading up to the speech and the speech itself indicated that the government was ready to take this seriously. We have in Ontario, about a third of childcare centers have closed because of the increased expenses of delivering care in a pandemic. And mothers are talking about just staying home instead of going back to work. And so, especially if you have children under 6, there is action they could have taken to support existing childcare centers in staying open to deliver care right now, the way that they're delivering $1 billion to long-term care homes. So I was hoping to see something like that. I was glad to see some money around training. That's a lesson learned from Quebec and how Quebec implemented that they didn't have enough skilled workers. And so to get started on the training, I think is a good plan. But there's definitely going to be a lot of skepticism because this has been promised several times in my lifetime and it hasn't come to fruition. And I just want to say this is not a social reset. This is an economic reset. If we had childcare for all children, it would contribute $1 billion to the economy, which is as much as the stimulus that the federal government is.
After World War I, Canada really was a global powerhouse. And that's in part because we were part of the British trading network. And that gave us preferential access over the Americans to the markets in Britain, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. And so actually, we were the ones making their cars, not Detroit. They were coming out of Windsor and out of Oshawa. And that made us the second largest producer of cars in the world. And that gave us the foundation where skills were developed, the infrastructure was developed for a manufacturing sector. Of course, we lost a lot of that after World War II as other places started producing their own cars. And by the 60s, we needed the auto pack to even survive because we had a large number of plants that just weren't producing enough. And so the numbers you showed there, starting in the mid-70s, are a reflection of the auto pack. And the auto pack really did give a boost to manufacturing, particularly in Ontario, particularly in cities like my own, where I worked in Windsor, and the plant I worked at Ford Motor Company, where I made engines, which is very much an auto pack plant. What has happened since is we have just lost sector after sector after sector. And if you think about Hamilton, where I live right now, we used to make elevators, we used to make Levi's, we used to make appliances, we made shoes, we used to make glass bottles, textiles and whatnot. It's all gone. And now the plant here in Hamilton, where we used to make appliances, it's a green field. Somebody cuts the grass, but that's the limit of the employment.
Well, let me ask you the bottom line question then. You clearly described a situation where manufacturing was the backbone of the provincial economy. Is it still?
No, absolutely not. I mean, the numbers you showed right there indicated less than 10% of our GDP comes from manufacturing. If you think about this in human terms, back in 1976, when about 4 million people were working in Ontario, almost 1 million of those were working in manufacturing. Today, about 8 million people are working in Ontario, but less than 800,000 of those are in manufacturing. And so people just don't look to manufacturing for a career. They're looking at other places in the economy for a life.
Well, I have a feeling that the woman who employs 26,000 people in 60 plants in 17 countries around the world may want to take issue with some of that. So Linda Hassenfratz, tell us, for those who say manufacturing's on its last legs, you say what?
Well, I couldn't disagree more with everything you've just heard. In fact, when I look at our own organization, we have grown dramatically over that exact same time frame. We've even grown dramatically over the last decade. I mean, if I look at our Canadian operations, because if we're going to, focusing just on Canada, our sales in Canada grew 76% over the last 7 years between 2012 and 2019. Our productivity increased 60%. Our workforce grew by 40%. Now, admittedly, the jobs are changing. We're doing more and more automation on the shop floor. So we tend to classify our folks into two categories: direct employees, who are people loading and unloading machines, and indirect is everybody else. I'm an indirect worker. So are folks in logistics or administration or maintenance, et cetera. So our numbers have changed a lot. So as I mentioned, since 2012, our overall workforce in Canada by 40%, but we've increased our indirect workforce by almost 70%. Our direct workforce has grown as well, but only about 20%. So you can see that the face of manufacturing is certainly changing. And to me, in my opinion, there's never been a more exciting time to be in the manufacturing sector. And I would strongly encourage people to indeed look to the manufacturing sector as a place to build a career, because there are a lot of exciting things going on, a lot of exciting jobs to be had, and we're doing a lot of important things in terms of coming up with solutions for some of the world's biggest problems, whether it be climate change or bringing clean water or food to a growing global population. Manufacturing is who's coming up with those solutions. So if you want to be part of that, you should join our industry.
So today we still have the same broad principle, which is that most of the time we are combining medications together, 3, sometimes 2, but usually 3 medications together. But those things now have much less in the way of side effects as medications, and they can be co-formulated together and taken just once a day. So most of the time when I have a new patient in the clinic, I'm able to start that person on 1 pill a day and maintain that person with just that 1 pill a day for the rest of their lives, which will be a fairly normal lifespan, and which will be, I think, very different to the life that would have been lived by somebody living with HIV 20 or 30 years ago, in the sense that people have, there's even some very interesting model that suggests that if I'm diagnosed with HIV today and start on medications, my life expectancy may be increased. I don't know that I completely believe this, but maybe increased above that of me without HIV, because not only do I have excellent medication, which is able to suppress the virus very well, but I'm going to be seeing the doctor more often, so perhaps I get other health care that has health benefits and is able to prolong my life as well. I don't know that life will be longer, but I certainly think that life expectancy will be almost the same, and there's much less in the way of stigma in the sense of the transmission to my unborn child is going to be minimized with the current regimen. Transmission to my partner is really prevented completely with current treatment. So that same treatment, if I am able to bring down the virus level to undetectable, that is going to prevent transmission to my partner, to the point that Justice Canada announced a few years ago that they no longer recommend prosecuting cases where patients do not, where a person living with HIV on treatment does not disclose their HIV status to their partner, because there is no realistic chance of transmission.
Well, let me follow up with you on this, because we talked again in the timeline at the beginning about PrEP, which is a preventative form of medication and treatment. How exactly does that work?
So PrEP is a simplified version of the same regimens that we use for treatment. So generally the treatment that we give will be 3 medications. PrEP is often 2 medications given together in one tablet called Truvada, was the original PrEP. And essentially, usually we give PrEP continuously. So every day I take one of those pills every day. And if I'm able to do that, that reduces my risk of acquiring HIV if I'm exposed, not to 0, but 95% plus reduction in my risk of acquiring HIV. And actually coming down the pipeline probably in a few years will be even better regimens. There's some very nice data coming out at the latest World AIDS Conference that an injectable medication given just once every couple of months is even more effective than that daily pill. So I think that the way that we prevent and treat HIV, we have injectable treatments coming as well, is going to change quite a bit over the next few years.
It looks like we're going to have a vaccine to COVID-19, potentially within a year of its arriving on the scene. And 40 years later, you still don't have one for HIV or AIDS. And I guess I need to know how annoying that is for you.
Well, so, I'm sure everybody's heard Dr. Fauci on television because he's also an HIV vaccine researcher, and you hear for 9 months, most of us who've been in the area of HIV vaccine and following that progress very closely, we're very worried about how likely is it that a new virus could be dealt with in a form of a potent vaccine, and at best, and even WHO, for COVID-19 said if it's 50% efficacious, we'll take it, considering the level of death that's occurring around the planet. So I'm delighted. I always say to people that if it were a pandemic flu, which we were quite prepared for, in fact, H1N1 we dealt with, very well, because flu vaccines, we know exactly how to make them. And it was made, and within months, we got rid of H1N1. This was a new virus that we didn't know anything about. Given the possibility that it's an RNA virus, it could have gone the way of HIV, which is also an RNA virus, and very difficult to formulate a vaccine against. But fortunately, we have gone the way of the flu rather than the HIV vaccine. So I'm happy that at least we won't be living in a pandemic for years and years. But on the other hand, there are lessons to be learned. I have to say that the COVID vaccine, one of the reasons for its success is how much more we understand about vaccines based on HIV vaccine and its failures in last 30 years. So a lot of those lessons were carried into the COVID-19 vaccines, but now we can flip it around and see how much we can learn from COVID-19 vaccines to take the field of HIV vaccine forward.
That's just some of what we covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's it for this Friday, December 4th, 2020. Next week, we'll hear from public health authorities on where the COVID curve seems to be headed, talk to outgoing Senator and former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Murray Sinclair, and meet Canadian singer-songwriter M. Greiner. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a wonderful weekend, and Steve will see you on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman. And by viewers like you. Thank you.